When British soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, they carried a rifle that was already nearly 50 years old. The short magazine Lee-Enfield, designed in 1895 and formally adopted in 1907, was still the standard issue weapon for Commonwealth forces. Meanwhile, their German adversaries wielded the Karabiner 98K, a refined descendant of the legendary Mauser action that had been perfected over decades. On paper, this shouldn't have worked. The German rifle was more accurate at range, more modern in its materials, and represented what many ballistics experts considered the pinnacle of bolt-action design. Yet British soldiers who captured German weapons on the battlefield frequently tossed them aside and kept their Lee-Enfields. This wasn't sentimentality or stubbornness, it was battlefield pragmatism born from hard experience. The Lee-Enfield story begins in the 1880s when the British Army recognised they needed a repeating rifle using smokeless powder. James Paris Lee, a Scottish-Canadian inventor, had designed a revolutionary detachable box magazine system. When combined with the rifling design by the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, the result was the magazine Lee-Enfield, first seeing service in the Second Boer War. By 1907, after several iterations, the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III emerged, the iconic SMLE that would serve through 2 world wars and countless colonial conflicts. What made this rifle stick around for nearly a century wasn't any single revolutionary feature, but rather a combination of practical design choices that prioritized what actually mattered in combat. The standard military thinking of the era emphasized long-range accuracy. European armies were obsessed with hitting targets at 800, 1,000, even 1,500 yards. The Germans particularly prided themselves on marksmanship, and their Mauser rifles reflected this philosophy with longer barrels and tighter manufacturing tolerances. The British took a different approach with the SMLE. They shortened the barrel to just 25.2 inches, making the rifle handier in trenches and vehicles. They accepted slightly reduced long-range accuracy because their combat studies showed that most infantry engagements happened within 300 yards. This was heresy to European military theorists, but it proved prophetic when the reality of trench warfare set in after 1914. The rifle's rear-locking bolt design raised eyebrows among firearms experts. Most military rifles, including the Mauser, used a front locking system where lugs near the chamber bore the pressure of firing. The Lee-Enfield's lugs sat at the rear of the bolt, which theoretically made it weaker and less accurate. Critics argued this design would never match the precision of a Mauser. They were right on the target range. But battlefields aren't target ranges, and the Lee-Enfield's design brought advantages that mattered more than shaving a few inches off group sizes at 600 yards. The longer bolt travel required by the rear locking system actually made the rifle faster to cycle, and the action proved more forgiving of dirt and debris. By 1939, when Britain again found itself at war with Germany, the SMLE was theoretically obsolete, yet production ramped up instead of phasing out. Factories in Britain, India and Australia churned out millions more. British commanders weren't clinging to tradition. They knew something that looked good in an engineering manual didn't always translate to superiority in combat. The British Army had a training standard that seemed impossible the first time recruits heard about it. Every soldier was expected to fire 15 aimed rounds per minute from the bolt-action Lee-Enfield. The truly skilled could push that to 30 rounds. This was called the Mad Minute, and it wasn't some peacetime showboating exercise. It was a fundamental tactical doctrine that would save the British Expeditionary Force in the opening months of World War I. On August 23, 1914, at the Belgian town of Mons, roughly 70,000 British soldiers faced nearly 160,000 German troops. The Germans expected a quick victory against what they assumed was a small, outdated force. Instead, they ran into a wall of rifle fire so intense that German commanders believed they were facing massed machine guns. They weren't. They were facing British riflemen doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. The SMLE's action was specifically designed for speed. The bolt handle sat at a 60-degree angle rather than the 90 degrees found on most military rifles. This shorter bolt throw meant less movement between shots. Your hand stayed in a natural position without excessive wrist rotation. The rifle's rear locking bolt required the shooter to cock the firing pin on closing rather than opening, which felt more intuitive during rapid fire. When you opened the bolt, the spent casing ejected smoothly without the resistance of compressing a mainspring. You focused entirely on getting the next round chambered. This system, combined with relentless training, transformed individual soldiers into devastating fire platforms. British musketry training was arguably the most intensive in the world. Recruits spent weeks at rifle ranges before they ever saw other aspects of combat training. They learned to fire from standing, kneeling, sitting, and prone positions. They practiced rapid magazine changes until they could swap a fresh 10-round magazine in under 3 seconds. They trained to estimate range by eye and adjust their sights accordingly. The SMLE's ladder sight system, while looking archaic compared to German designs, was actually faster to adjust under stress. You flipped a lever, slid the sight to the range marking you needed, and locked it down. No fine adjustments, no overthinking, just combat practical speed. The Mad Men at qualification required hitting a 12-inch target at 300 yards 15 times in 60 seconds. That meant you had to load a fresh magazine mid-drill while maintaining accuracy. Soldiers who could manage 20 hits earned marksman status. The legendary sergeant instructor Snoxall reportedly achieved 38 hits in 1 minute during a 1914 demonstration, though this required an assistant feeding him loaded magazines. The point wasn't to break records, it was to ingrain muscle memory so deep that rapid, accurate fire became automatic under the stress and chaos of battle. At Mons, German troops advancing in formation were cut down at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. After-action reports describe entire German companies being stopped cold by what they genuinely believed was sustained machine gun fire from multiple positions. In reality, sections of 8 to 10 British riflemen were producing that volume of fire. A German lieutenant captured later that week told interrogators he'd counted the rate of fire and estimated his unit was facing at least 20 machine guns. He couldn't comprehend that bolt-action rifles could generate such firepower. The British had just 4 machine guns per battalion at Mons. The rest was rifles, training, and the SMLE's rapid-fire capability doing exactly what it was designed to do. Trench warfare was a gun designer's nightmare. Everything that looked elegant in a factory testing facility became a liability when subjected to the reality of the Western Front. Rifles spent days and weeks exposed to rain, snow, and the unique corrosive mud of Flanders, a clay-heavy soup that worked its way into every crevice. Soldiers couldn't maintain their weapons like peacetime manuals suggested. There was no heated armory, no clean workspace, no luxury of proper cleaning supplies. You got what moisture you could shake off, maybe a rag if you were lucky, and whatever oil hadn't been used up weeks ago. In these conditions, the Lee-Enfield thrived while more advanced rifles failed. The SMLE's secret was in its looseness. British manufacturing tolerances were deliberately less precise than German standards. Parts had more play, more clearance between moving surfaces. To a precision-minded engineer, this looked like inferior craftsmanship. To a soldier in a trench, it meant the difference between a rifle that worked and a rifle that became a club. When mud or ice got into the action, the Lee-Enfield's generous clearances let it cycle anyway. The bolt might feel gritty and rough, but it still moved. The Mauser 98K, with its tighter tolerances and front locking lugs positioned right where debris accumulated near the chamber, would bind and jam. German soldiers found themselves frantically trying to clear their actions while British troops kept firing. The cock-on-closing mechanism provided another survival advantage. Because the mainspring only compressed when you closed the bolt, opening it required less force. If your action started binding from dirt or corrosion, you could still muscle the bolt open to clear a jam or eject a stuck case. The Mauser's cock-on opening design meant you fought against mainspring pressure while simultaneously trying to break loose, fouled lugs. In freezing conditions, when metal contracted and any moisture became ice, this difference became critical. British troops in the winter of 1917 reported their rifles still functioning when German prisoners' weapons had frozen solid. The prisoners hadn't maintained their rifles any worse, they simply had less forgiving machines. Water resistance wasn't accidental. The SMLE's magazine design featured a cutoff that let you use the rifle as a single-shot weapon, while keeping your magazine in reserve. More importantly, the magazine well had drainage. Water that got inside could flow out rather than pooling around cartridges and causing corrosion or feeding malfunctions. The Mauser's internal magazine, fed from stripper clips, had no such drainage. Water that entered the action stayed there, mixing with gun oil and powder residue to form a corroding paste. British armourers salvaging German weapons after major offensives noted that captured Mausers often had rust and corrosion in the magazine, well even when the external metal looked fine. The rifle's wood furniture contributed to reliability in ways that seemed counterintuitive. The SMLE's stock was made from walnut, usually Indian walnut, which was relatively soft and absorbed impact without cracking. when soldiers used their rifles as hammering tools to drive trench stakes, open ammunition crates, or break ice. The Lee-Enfield stock survived abuse that would shatter the harder beechwood commonly used in Mauser stocks. A cracked stock wasn't just cosmetic damage, it affected accuracy and, if severe enough, could make the rifle dangerous to fire. British ordnance reports from the Somme offensive noted that Lee-Enfield's return for repair had far fewer catastrophic stock failures than captured German rifles subjected to similar use. The Mauser 98 Action is often called the most successful bolt-action rifle design in history, and for good reason. Paul Mauser's 1898 design became the template that dozens of countries copied or adapted. Its controlled feed extractor gripped the cartridge rim as soon as the round left the magazine, guiding it smoothly into the chamber. The dual front locking lugs positioned right at the chamber gave maximum support exactly where pressures peaked during firing. The three-position safety allowed the bolt to be opened with the safety engaged for unloading. On paper and on the range, the Mauser represented the pinnacle of bolt-action engineering. German soldiers were trained to be marksmen, and their weapon reflected that emphasis on precision. At 600 yards, a skilled German rifleman with a Ki-98K would consistently outshoot a British soldier with an SMLE. But wars aren't won at 600 yards on a known distance range. The Mauser's strength was also its limitation. Those tight tolerances that guaranteed precision made the action less forgiving. The controlled feed system, while theoretically superior for reliability, required the bolt to travel through a longer, more complex path. You had to lift the bolt handle a full 90 degrees, pull straight back for a considerable distance, push the new round forward while ensuring it engaged the extractor properly, then rotate the handle back down. Each movement had to be deliberate and complete. Rush it, and you get a failure to feed or a double feed. Under stress, when your hands were cold or shaking, when you needed to get rounds downrange immediately, that complexity became a handicap. German military doctrine emphasized deliberate, aimed fire. Their training manuals stressed breath control, trigger squeeze, proper sight picture. A German soldier was expected to make every shot count, particularly at longer ranges where the Mauser's superior accuracy showed itself. This philosophy made sense in the context of late 19th century warfare, where engagements happened at longer distances and ammunition supply was a constant concern. But by 1914, and certainly by 1939, infantry combat had changed. Automatic weapons provided sustained fire. Artillery dominated the battlefield. The infantryman's role was increasingly about rapid response at closer ranges. Exactly where the SMLE's advantages emerged. The practical difference showed in rate of fire. A trained German soldier could fire approximately 10 to 12 aimed rounds per minute with the Ki-98K. This was respectable, better than most other armies equipped with similar rifles, but it was half the SMLE's standard. In a firefight lasting 2 minutes, a British soldier could put 30 rounds downrange, while his German counterpart managed 24 at best. Those extra 6 rounds represented potential casualties inflicted or suppression fire that kept enemy heads down. Multiply that across a platoon and the difference became decisive. German small unit tactics had to rely more heavily on their excellent MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns to provide the volume of fire that British sections could generate with rifles alone. The Mauser's longer barrel, 23.6 inches compared to the SMLE's 25.2 inches, gave it superior muzzle velocity and flatter trajectory at range. German snipers loved the Ki-98K for this reason. But for the average infantryman, that extra accuracy potential was wasted. Combat studies from both world wars consistently showed that most soldiers couldn't effectively use their weapon's maximum accurate range under battlefield stress. The noise, confusion, fear, and physical exhaustion of combat degraded marksmanship far more than any inherent accuracy limitation of the weapon. The SMLE was accurate enough for the ranges where fighting actually happened, and its faster operation mattered more than precision. Most soldiers couldn't achieve anyway. Magazine capacity seems like a minor technical detail until you're in a firefight and counting rounds. The Lee-Enfield held 10 rounds in a detachable box magazine. The Mauser Ki-98K held 5 rounds in an internal magazine fed from stripper clips. That 2-to-1 advantage fundamentally changed how soldiers fought. When a British section opened fire, they could sustain that fire twice as long before needing to reload. When they did reload, swapping magazines took roughly 3 seconds with a practiced motion. Drop the empty, insert a fresh one, chamber a round. A German soldier reloading his Mauser had to open the bolt, position a 5-round stripper clip in the guide, push the cartridges down with thumb pressure until they fed into the magazine, extract the empty clip, then chamber the first round. Even a well-trained soldier needed 6 to 8 seconds, and that's assuming the clip fed smoothly without jamming. The mathematics of small unit combat made this capacity difference multiply across an engagement. A standard British infantry section consisted of 10 men. In a sustained firefight with all rifles firing, that section could deliver 100 rounds before anyone needed to reload. A comparable German squad of 10 men could deliver 50 rounds. If the engagement lasted 2 minutes and both sides maintained their trained rates of fire, the British section put roughly 300 rounds downrange, while the German squad managed around 200 to 240. This wasn't just about ammunition expenditure, it was about maintaining continuous fire. While German soldiers were reloading, British soldiers were still shooting. That sustained pressure kept enemy troops suppressed, prevented them from maneuvering, and created opportunities for flanking or advancing. The detachable magazine system gave British soldiers tactical flexibility that internal magazines couldn't match. You could carry loaded magazines in pouches on your webbing, ready for instant use. Standard British battle order included 2 pouches holding 5 10-round magazines each, 50 rounds in easily accessible magazines, plus another 50 loose rounds in bandoliers for refilling magazines during lulls in fighting. This meant a soldier could fire 50 aimed rounds in under 4 minutes without needing to fumble with loose cartridges. German soldiers carried their ammunition in pouches designed for stripper clips, which was efficient for the Mauser's design, but meant every reload required manipulating small metal clips under stress. Drop a clip in the mud or grass, and those 5 rounds became difficult to recover and use. The magazine cutoff feature added another layer of practicality. By engaging the cutoff, you converted the SMLE into a single-shot rifle while keeping your magazine fully loaded in reserve. This made sense in scenarios where ammunition conservation mattered, but you might suddenly need rapid fire. You could pick off targets individually, feeding single rounds through the action, then instantly release the cutoff and have 10 rounds available if the situation escalated. The Mauser had no equivalent feature. You either used your magazine or you loaded single rounds, but you couldn't seamlessly transition between modes. Reloading under pressure revealed another advantage. The SMLE's magazine well was generously sized and beveled. Even in darkness or when exhausted and shaking, you could guide a magazine into place by feel. The magazine catch was positioned where your trigger finger naturally reached when your hand shifted grip for reloading. One press, the empty magazine dropped free. Insert, push until you heard the click, and you were back in action. The Mauser's internal magazine meant there was nothing to drop or insert, which sounds like an advantage until you realize that also meant no quick reload option. Once your 5 rounds were gone, you had to feed the rifle slowly, cartridge by cartridge or clip by clip. German soldiers envied the British magazine system even as they took pride in their rifles' other qualities. Private Harold Boughton of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment wrote home in October 1914, describing a curious incident after the First Battle of Ypres. His section had overrun a German position and found several abandoned Mauser rifles in excellent condition. The men examined them with professional interest. These were, after all, the weapons that German propaganda claimed were superior to anything the British carried. Boughton's sergeant, a career soldier with 12 years' service, worked the Mauser's action, sighted down the barrel, and handed it back with a simple comment. "Fine weapon for a Sunday shoot. I'll keep me Lee-Enfield for killing Germans, thanks." The captured rifles were turned over to headquarters. Every man in that section kept his SMLE. This pattern repeated itself throughout both world wars. After major engagements, British and Commonwealth troops had opportunities to acquire German weapons. Some kept them as souvenirs. Some used captured ammunition when their own supplies ran low, but when given a genuine choice, soldiers overwhelmingly preferred their Lee-Enfields. Corporal Jack Thomas, who fought in North Africa with the 8th Army, kept a diary that survived the war. In an entry from January 1943, after the fighting around Mareth Line, he described his platoon stripping a German supply dump. They took ammunition, food, even a few MP-40 submachine guns, but the captured KN-98K rifles were left behind. Thomas wrote, "The lads won't trade their rifles. Jerry's looks smart, but ours shoots faster, and that's what counts when they're running at you." Lieutenant William Douglas Home, who served with the Royal Armoured Corps, recorded his observations in letters that were later published. After interrogating German prisoners in Normandy during July 1944, he noted their respect for British marksmanship and rate of fire. One German sergeant told him through a translator that his squad had been convinced they were facing automatic weapons during an engagement near Caen. When Douglas Home explained it was bolt-action rifles, the sergeant didn't believe him initially. He'd counted the incoming fire and insisted no bolt-action rifle could sustain that volume. Douglas Home brought out an SMLE and demonstrated the mad minute technique. The sergeant's expression, Douglas Home wrote, was a mixture of respect and profound annoyance at having been beaten by what he'd considered obsolete equipment. The perspectives weren't purely British. Indian Army troops, who made up a substantial portion of Commonwealth forces, were equally devoted to the rifle they called 303 after its caliber. Sepoy Gian Singh of the 4th Indian Division wrote in Punjabi to his family describing the East African campaign against Italian forces in 1941. His unit captured Italian Carcano rifles and German Mausers being used by colonial troops. Singh described trying a Mauser and finding it too slow for battle, good only for careful shooting. The Indian Army had been using Lee-Enfield since 1905, and soldiers from the northwest frontier to Burma consistently praised its reliability and speed. Indian troops fought in some of the war's harshest conditions: desert heat, monsoon humidity, mountain cold, and their testimonies repeatedly emphasized that the SMLE functioned when other rifles failed. Australian soldiers were notoriously pragmatic about equipment. If something worked better, they used it regardless of regulations. Sergeant Bill Griffiths, who fought at Tobruk and El Alamein with the 9th Australian Division, kept notes that formed the basis of a post-war memoir. He described captured German equipment being evaluated constantly. Australian troops happily adopted German stick grenades, which they found superior to British Mills bombs for certain tasks. They scavenged German optics and machine guns. But Griffiths noted that in all his time in North Africa and later in the Pacific, he never saw an Australian soldier voluntarily replace his Lee-Enfield with a captured rifle. The attitude, he wrote, was simple. The bloody thing works, shoots straight enough and shoots fast. Why would you change? The North African desert tested weapons in ways European battlefields never could. Sand worked into every mechanism with the persistence of water. Temperature swings from freezing nights to 120-degree days, expanded and contracted metal parts. The moisture from coastal regions combined with sand to create an abrasive paste that could wear down moving parts in weeks. British forces fighting across Libya, Egypt and Tunisia from 1940 to 1943 found the SMLE handled these conditions better than virtually any other rifle in theatre. German troops respected the Mauser's precision, but their field manuals included extensive sections on desert maintenance. Special procedures required to keep the K98K functioning. British manuals simply said to shake out the sand and keep firing. The loose tolerances that engineers criticised became salvation in the desert. Sand that would jam a Mauser's tighter action simply fell through the Lee-Enfield's more generous clearances. Australian and New Zealand troops at Tobruk fought through sandstorms that reduced visibility to arm's length. When the sand cleared, their rifles still worked. The Italian Carcano rifles used by opposing forces frequently seized completely after sandstorms, requiring full disassembly. Even the Mauser needed significant cleaning before reliable function returned. British armourers' reports from the siege of Tobruk noted that Lee-Enfields came back for repair with sand literally caked inside the action. Yet most still functioned well enough for combat. One report from August 1941 documented a rifle that had fired over 200 rounds during a 3-day engagement without cleaning and was still operational when finally inspected. Burma and the Pacific Theatre brought opposite extremes. Torrential monsoon rains, jungle humidity that kept metal perpetually damp, and mud that made Flanders look dry by comparison. The British 14th Army, fighting in Burma from 1942 to 1945, operated in conditions where metal rusted overnight and wooden stocks swelled from moisture absorption. Japanese Arisaka rifles, well-designed weapons in their own right, suffered from humidity affecting their chrome-lined bores and causing feeding issues. The SMLE's unlined bore required more frequent cleaning but proved less prone to the pitting and corrosion that plagued chromed barrels when the plating failed. The walnut stocks absorb moisture without the dramatic swelling that affected the denser woods used in Japanese and some German rifles. British troops operating in the Arakan and along the Chindwin River often went weeks without proper weapon maintenance facilities. Sergeant Charles Carfrae of the Border Regiment described his rifle after 3 weeks of continuous jungle operations in early 1944. The metal was spotted with surface rust, the stock had turned nearly black from moisture and handling, and the barrel was fouled from hundreds of rounds without proper cleaning. Yet when his unit engaged Japanese positions at the Ngakyadok Pass, the rifle functioned perfectly. Carfrae wrote that he'd seen captured Japanese rifles in far better cosmetic condition that wouldn't cycle reliably because moisture had affected their tighter actions and caused feeding problems. The Arctic presented yet another test. British and Canadian forces operating in Norway in 1940 and later Allied troops in Northern Europe during the winter of 1944-45 faced temperatures that dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Lubricants thickened into gel. Metal contracted, moisture froze instantly. The German solution was to use minimal lubrication and special cold weather oils, but this required specific supplies that weren't always available to frontline troops. The British solution was simpler. Remove all oil from the Lee-Enfield's action and run it dry. The rifle's design allowed it to function without lubrication in extreme cold. Canadian troops fighting in the Scheldt estuary during November 1944 reported their Lee-Enfields functioning reliably in sleet and freezing rain that left German prisoners' rifles frozen and inoperable. The cock and closing action meant less force required to open the bolt, which mattered when metal contracted from cold, and every movement required extra effort. The Lee-Enfield's service life tells a story that contradicts conventional wisdom about military technology. The rifle entered British service in 1895 as the magazine Lee-Enfield, evolved into the SMLE in 1907, and remained the standard British and Commonwealth infantry weapon through World War II. But its story didn't end in 1945. India continued manufacturing Lee-Enfields until the 1980s. The rifle saw combat in Korea, Malaya, Kenya, Suez, and the Falklands. Canadian Rangers in the Arctic still issued the No. 4 MKY variant until 2015, 120 years after the Lee-Enfield design first appeared. No other military bolt-action rifle approaches this service record. The Mauser 98K, despite its technical excellence, was replaced within years of Germany's defeat. The American Springfield 1903, the Japanese Arisaka, the Soviet Mosin Nagant, all were phased out within a generation of World War II's end. Only the Lee-Enfield persisted. This longevity wasn't nostalgia or bureaucratic inertia. It was recognition that the rifle got the fundamentals right in ways that mattered more than specifications suggested. The British hadn't set out to build the most accurate rifle or the most precisely manufactured rifle. They'd built a rifle optimized for what infantry combat actually required: sustained rapid fire, reliability under adverse conditions, and simplicity of operation under stress. These priorities seemed almost pedestrian compared to the Mauser's engineering elegance, but they proved more valuable than precision that most soldiers couldn't exploit. The SMLE represented a philosophy that effectiveness in the field trumped excellence on paper. Modern military small arms development has repeatedly relearned the Lee-Enfield's lessons. The M16 rifle's early failures in Vietnam came partly from tight tolerances that made the weapon jam in jungle conditions, the same problem that plagued the Mauser in mud and sand. The solution involved loosening tolerances and adding chrome lining, essentially applying principles the SMLE had embodied since 1907. The AK-47's legendary reliability comes from generous clearances that let it function when filled with dirt, exactly what made the Lee-Enfield work in trenches 70 years earlier. Contemporary military doctrine emphasizes volume of fire and rapid engagement at shorter ranges rather than long-range precision marksmanship, the same philosophy that led Britain to prioritize the mad minute over 1,000-yard accuracy. The rifle story offers broader lessons about military technology and procurement. Advanced engineering doesn't automatically translate to battlefield superiority. The Mauser was objectively more sophisticated in its design: controlled feed, dual front locking lugs, superior metallurgy. But sophistication creates complexity, and complexity creates failure points. The Lee-Enfield succeeded through simplicity and forgiveness. Its loose tolerances, rear-locking bolts, and straightforward manual of arms made it easier to use and harder to break. Soldiers didn't need to be expert gunsmiths to keep it running. This matters because wars are fought by conscripts and reservists, not just career soldiers. A weapon that only performs excellently in expert hands is less valuable than one that performs adequately in anyone's hands. The economic lesson is equally relevant. Britain produced roughly 17 million Lee-Enfields across all variants from 1895 to the 1950s. The manufacturing process used simpler tooling and less precise machining than the Mauser required. This meant factories could be set up faster, workers trained more quickly, and production costs kept lower. During World War II, when industrial capacity determined how many rifles an army could field, the SMLE's manufacturability became strategic advantage. Germany produced excellent rifles, but never enough of them. Britain produced good enough rifles in sufficient quantity to arm not just its own forces but provide weapons to resistance movements and allied nations across the globe. Adequate weapons in sufficient quantity beat superior weapons in limited numbers. The Lee-Enfield proved that old doesn't mean obsolete, and modern doesn't guarantee better. It proved that understanding how soldiers actually fight matters more than theoretical performance. Most importantly, it proved that the best weapon isn't the one that wins design competitions. It's the one that keeps working when everything else has failed, that soldiers trust with their lives, and that gets them home alive. The British Tommy's preference for his outdated rifle over German modern weapons wasn't stubbornness. It was wisdom.